I'll try to talk a little bit about not exactly what is a community, not exactly what is a digital age, but I will try to talk about what is the Lusophone community. The reason why I'm not addressing exactly the dilemmas, the theoretical difficulties of community or communities is because we are in the last conference, the last state conference. We have all been discussing this. And yes, of course, we could have another conference or stay here the full day discussing the digital age. Well, let's just assume that we live in the digital age and try to move on for the purpose of this presentation. So I will try to address the Lusophone community. The Lusophone community, and the word is actually formalized, you know, obviously the concept of community is used in the most multiple ways, but there is a formal Portuguese language countries communities. It's a political structures. These Lusophone movements, they have started in the 80s, and originally I cannot say that the politics was the primary drive for these movements. Well, mostly, you know, artistic, academic. Yeah, there was some political forces, but they were not the central aspects. But in 1996, a number of countries have organized themselves and they have constituted the Portuguese language communities. Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Equatorial Guinea more recently, Guinea-Bissau in '96, Mozambique, Portugal, and São Tomé and Príncipe. All these countries are in very different continents. They are across 4 continents. Obviously, I mean, if you look at the red countries, you can see it's very obvious that Brazil is the most important Lusophone country. Angola and Mozambique, they are also very, very important countries. Then you have Portugal, and then you have, let's say, tiny islands in the Atlantic, Cape Verde, and small countries like São Tomé and Príncipe and Guinea-Bissau. So this is really a very scattered community. So the Lusophone countries, they are highly heterogeneous in terms of size, in terms of economic development, in terms of overlapping regional alliances, because they belong to the Lusophone community, but they also belong to other communities like Mercosul with Brazil or others. So they are really different in terms of cultural and social practices. In terms of literature about Lusophony, there is now quite a lot of literature on the topic. There is, I would say, more skeptical literature on the Lusophony, and Eduardo Lourenço is a very important Portuguese author, and he has been very skeptical and very critical about this concept and this construct. And this is one sentence from him. He says, Lusophony fulfills an imaginary space of imperial nostalgia, so we Portuguese can feel less isolated and more visible in the world, given that the empirical cycle is definitely over. Lourenço is just an example of one of these critical, skeptical authors. Obviously, all this more skeptical thinking has to do with the colonial past. And this map is a map that was taught in the Portuguese schools some years ago. So what it's written in Portuguese is Portugal is not a small country. And it is, you know, and the authors of this map which were used in the Portuguese schools not that many years ago, it was not 100 years ago, represents Angola and Mozambique, just two countries of this empire, to show that these two countries combined, basically, it's the entire Europe, so Portugal is not tiny, so all these views, they are still in people's memories, they are still part of our common memory. So this also helps to justify and to explain the skepticism. But there are now other authors who look at Lusophony in a quite different perspective. They are still skeptical, they are still critical. I'm not addressing them in this talk, the apologetic ones, but they look at Lusophony in a operational and practical, as a practical classification, which states a given vision of the world or division of the world. Actually, it can be seen as an operational classification. And in this sense, Lusophony has practical functions, and it is designed to produce social effects. One author, Moisés Martins, is a colleague of mine in my research center, states, and I'm quoting him, that Lusophony is a piece in the world's symbolic coordination battlefield. So this is this is in a way a movement of resistance towards, let's say, Anglophony, Francophony, and all other major visions of the world. We are actually facing some difficulties in terms of addressing this topic. It's not easy. It's not easy for the authors who have been doing far more work than myself. It's not easy for me. So I decided to bring two common, probably most common analytical shortcomings. I was thinking, what are the problems? And I have identified, in a very probably simplistic way, but I have identified two problems. Portugal is often perceived as the center of the Lusophone community. And the other problem is the examination of top-down structures rather than the interplay between top-down and bottom-up dynamics. I will try to explain these two analytical shortcomings. First, I'd like to tell you that it's quite obvious for me that Portugal is not the center of the Lusophone community. It was not the center when it was set up in the 80s and then formally in the 90s, and it's not the center today. It's difficult to tell you, well, the center is Brazil or the center is Angola, but well, these are probably the countries who are more powerful, and power is a difficult concept, but these are probably, for economic reasons, for size reasons, these are really important countries. Brazil, well, if you look at Brazil, Brazil has 150 million people, all Portuguese speakers, and it's an emerging and really strong economy. So looking at our area more specifically, media and culture, I would say that Brazil is one obvious example of what could be called cultural reverse dependency. If we're talking, let's say, in terms of core and periphery, we would be talking about reverse dependency. If you just think about telenovelas, the Brazilian soap operas, they are everywhere. They dominate the Portuguese media scene. They are seen with watched with lots of attention and interest. You have lots of Brazilian talk shows in the Portuguese channels. You know, quite a few authors like John Sinclair or others, Strobar, who have been working on this. So I would say that in the Anglo-Saxon world, you can probably learn a bit about the power of Brazil. So I will just briefly address the Angolan case, because the Angolan case and the power of Angola in Portugal, for example, is less well known for this community. I'm assuming, I might be wrong, but I'm assuming. Well, Angola is really powerful. It has oil, diamonds, you know, all sorts of resources. And it has been expanding into Portugal in many areas. Expansion into building, real estate, banking sectors, and this started happening in considerable terms since 2007. The co-optation of the Portuguese political elite has been impressive. It really has been impressive. I just brought a few figures from from some authors who have been looking at this into detail. And just to give you an example, 27 former ministers or Secretary of States are into boards of Angolan companies. 120 politicians are in the boards of 17 Portuguese business with Angolan capital. So it's really everywhere. But the media has also attracted the interest of Angola. And this really has had a very important impact. This lady in Caras is a VIP magazine, is the daughter of President Eduardo dos Santos, is the president of Angola. He has been in power for 37 years. He's still there. And his daughter, well, she has been educated in London, in the United Kingdom. And in this magazine, in the cover of this magazine, it simply says that Isabel dos Santos is the most powerful woman in Portugal. Well, but you could say, well, okay, this is being said by a VIP journal or magazine, so it's not very serious. But interestingly, you also have let's say, the Portuguese Financial Times, or, you know, let's say serious newspaper, Negócios means business. And you have these newspapers representing Isabel dos Santos, her husband, and with, you know, a cozy romantic saying, with her husband saying that sometimes he's lucky enough to have her as his wife and not just being her husband. You know, so serious press is actually being very nice, to say the least, to Isabel dos Santos and to the Angolan elite. There are reasons for this. Isabel dos Santos, according to Forbes magazine, is the richest woman in Africa. She doesn't really have any direct interest in Portuguese media groups, but her presence is clear through the participation in banks. So she's not buying directly media, but she's buying banks who have direct or who have interests in the media. She's also developing partnerships with important economic groups like SONAI. SONAI is a very big economic group in Portugal, And Sonai owns the most prestigious daily newspaper called Público. And in addition to this, she is the largest individual shareholder of the two biggest national operators, telecommunications operators. We have two big telecommunication operators, NOS and Portugal Telecom, and she is the largest individual shareholder. But more directly, in terms of the media, or the media elite, we have a company called Lusophone, which is based on Angolan capital, but the base is formally is Panama, and entered the Portuguese media market and acquired a weekly newspaper called Sol, and it's also buying parts. By the end of 2011, it held 15% of Cofina, the group which has the biggest national newspaper, Correio da Manhã. Well, although they have been changing a few things more recently, but this really is a very important investment. More recently, there has been a new Angolan investor, António Mosquito, who is also identified with the Angolan elite, with the president, has acquired 66 or 68% of one of the Portuguese biggest construction companies, Soares da Costa, and is one of the Portuguese three biggest media groups. So he controls Control Invest, which is one of the most important media groups in Portugal. Control Invest owns some of the oldest newspapers and also a very prestigious 24 news radio station. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this picture. This was not developed by me. It was developed by academics who have been working on the Angolan ties in the Portuguese economy. If I started detailing this, you would easily get to the conclusion that the money is everywhere. So it's in the media, very strongly in the media, but not only in the media. So basically, I'd like to tell you that I don't think that Portugal is the center or the locus of power of Lusophony, of the Lusophone community. And this idea needs to be reconsidered as political, as economic, as cultural terms. So I think that if you're Portuguese and if you want to study Lusophony, you can relax. You might not be accused of being neo-colonialist. So I think that we are quite safe. The other analytical shortcoming, in my view, is the examination of formal top-down Lusophony structures. There has been attention from academics on the geopolitical dimension, on the structures that have been developed by politicians, but not so much about the interplay between top-down and bottom-up dynamics. And I think we should do this, because looking just at the wider picture or the wider structure might not really take us much further. I think we should look at small pieces and details and how they somehow interact and interconnect, so a wider construction is actually or is not built. So actually, if we look at some studies. There are not so many, I should be honest, but there are a few, at least PhD dissertations, who actually show that the Lusophone associations, I'm using here the word Lusophone associations when more than one Portuguese-speaking countries are aggregated. Lusophone associations, networks, entities, both formal and informal, they are actually flourishing. There is a boom. This is also something that you can see just reading the newspapers, you know, because every single day you see something new, something Lusophone new, some new entity or structure. And the Lusophone dynamics are identifiable in all social areas. From cultural activities, the cultural groups are very dynamic. Sports, there are Lusophone games everywhere, you know. Health, human rights, environment, business, academic, you know. So this is something that is happening, is actually growing, it's expanding. I'll just give you one example of one of these associations. I'll use our academic field. Lusocom, for example, is the Federation of Lusophone Communication Associations. So integrates the Portuguese SOPCOM, the Brazilian Intercom, the Angolan entity Angocom. So, you know, it integrates a number of subject associations from different countries. Well, Lusocom does what most academic entities do, you know, scientific cooperation with regular meetings. This is rotative. These meetings are in Brazil, in Mozambique, you know, in Portugal. There is, of course, academic mobility programs, and they are expanding. These things are really developing. There's also a Lusophone Journal of Cultural Studies, you know. So our field is also one small piece of this construct. So we have these civil society dynamics, but I would like to emphasize that they are not necessarily articulated with wider geopolitical and economic interests. The thing is, some of these structures, they find the Lusophone political structure, they fight governments, you know, so you have all kinds of movements. Some want to support to the wider construction, others couldn't care less, you know, and others are resistant. So I would say that the Lusophone community results from the interplay of societal inputs and political institutions, top-down decisions. Well, I'm using one sociologist, Maciel. She's an author who has been looking at this, and she says that despite fierce criticism to the ideological basis of the Lusophone project and the motives for its creation and its modus operandus, I don't want to be naive about the modus operandus of the Lusophone community, but she says the Lusophone community seems to be more than a space that brings back memories of exploitation, indifference, and conflict. Given the new possibilities of globalization, the Lusophone community expresses new dynamics and synergies. And I would add new possibilities and eventually new solidarities. So how the digital helps to shape communities? Tough. I will not I will not solve this problem here. Well, in any case, a week ago I went to the Internet World Statistics to try to figure out the relevance of Portuguese in the Internet, and it's still the fifth language. So there is a lot of activity in the Internet. So the Internet is being used to communicate, and obviously these structures, these associations are also using the Internet in very different ways, but there is a lot of activity. I know that access and Internet penetration is probably not, let's say, the best way to see or to understand what's going on, but I'd like to show you the big differences in terms of Internet penetration and in terms of possibilities to connect digitally in these countries. If you look at Angola, 26% of the population has access to the Internet. Cape Verde is a very poor country in terms of natural resources, but it is a well-organized or relatively well-organized country, and they invest in education. So if you think that they are a scattered islands in the Atlantic without water and without any kind of natural resources, it's quite surprising that they have these rates. Equatorial Guinea 18, Guinea-Bissau, well, sometimes they don't have electricity. I had a student from Guinea-Bissau who sometimes was telling me that she couldn't do this or that because she simply doesn't have electricity, and I asked her, could you go elsewhere? No, there's no electricity in the country. Okay. So, so Mozambique also has a very low penetration rate. Saint Tomé and Prince slightly better. In terms of Brazil made a tremendous improvement recently. 60% of the population has access to the Internet. East Timor is 24%. And Portugal is, in comparative terms, by far the country which has the highest penetration, Internet penetration in the Lusophone countries. Although, if you compare with the Nordic countries in Europe or or Luxembourg, it's quite limited. So, I would say that digital networks and online spaces have the potential to facilitate communication between citizens who think, feel, and speak in the same language. I'm not explaining how this is done, but there is this potential. People can communicate, they think in one language, they feel at home in that language, and they can express themselves through digital communities. Lourdes Macedo is another author who has recently did a PhD thesis. She's from my research center, and she mapped the Lusophone blogs. And basically, she concluded that effectively thousands of Portuguese language sites, blogs, and digital fora have inundated. She also shows this boom. It really there has been an enormous growth. Now the question is how debates, discussions, and sharing contribute to a wider sense of belonging in the Internet political Lusophone community. How does this relate? Well, unfortunately, the academic community has not really addressed this issue. I hope it will happen. So the articulation between the online space and the multiple micro-Lusophone communities, these are really, really different from hyperlocal to thematic, but this articulation between these micro-communities and the wider geopolitical multi-continental community is not clear. I could try, to put forward some ideas to explain, but I'm still struggling. I'm still struggling. So, very briefly, just two concluding remarks. One, and I'm just going back to the difficulties I have mentioned before. I think one should acknowledge, without any lack of clarity, that there is a formal structure called the Lusophone community that was set up in '96, and it was set up due to common political will and interests. I'm not discussing the legitimacy of these interests. Some were possibly good, others possibly were not so good, but it was constructed, it was set up. And it is important to acknowledge that it really is a post-colonial reconstruct. But Portugal is not, this is my view, is not the leading actor. Portugal, let's be honest, it's a peripheral country in Europe. Its economy is in tremendous difficulty. It does really has a power voice in Europe or in the world. So it's a peripheral country in a disoriented Europe. So I don't really think that we should be concerned about these neo-colonial dramas or concerns. It is a post-colonial reconstruct, but Portugal is not in the center. And the other point has to do with the other analytical shortcoming. The Lusophone political community per se does not explain the proliferation of Lusophone micro-communities. I don't think we can say seriously that it's because there is this political, formal structure that we have this boom of micro-political economies, micro-communities. But I think language should be brought to this analysis, because it is through language that a shared discursive patrimony, both divergent and convergent, conflictual or non-conflictual, is developed. So I'm aware of the time, so this is my last slide. I would finish saying that a common language allows for the development of comprehensible texts that permanently reconstruct community. So I think we should pay attention to language, and this is something I'd like to say to a community to whom English is the lingua franca. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.